All right. All right, folks, your presenter for tonight for Vladimir Putin's Russia is Brandon Gauthier. He is, uh, he completed his doctorate in modern history at Fordham University in New York City. He is an adjunct professor of history for Fordham University and the director of global education at the Derryfield School. He speaks passionately and loudly about his enduring interest in the lives of people, both ordinary and extraordinary, who find themselves caught up in the waves of history. And I am very happy to welcome you back, Brandon. Take it away.
Hey, but you nailed my last name.
Gauthier.
This is serious. This is very impressive. Most people say Gauthier. Gauthier would be lovely, but I'm from Louisiana originally, and there's a Cajun French perversion of Gauthier into Gaucher, and people would say Gauthier here, and this makes me sad. But you can always obviously call me Brandon, but students tend to call me Dr. G. So give me 1 second, and we'll be ready to roll. I'm gonna share my slideshow with everyone watching online. Everyone online, I will try to stay in front of the computer as much as possible. Confession, I'm not very good at it. I like to pace. I like to engage. I like to talk. So I will do my best to stay in front of the computer where you can hear me and see what's going on. So let us begin. Today's discussion immediately starts with some degree of falsehood. We are not going to make it to 2025. When I was working on this presentation, I realized that this is probably a 3 or 4 hour discussion. So what I'm going to do tonight is speak to you about the upbringing of Vladimir Putin and help answer some questions about how did Putin come to power and what has been the style of his rule? How does he lead? There is a framing question for tonight's discussion. And that framing question is one for you to decide. I will make an argument about it, but you are welcome to make up your own mind. Is Vladimir Putin a tyrant? Does Vladimir Putin's rule within Russia represent tyranny, a tyrannical form of authority? I would argue it does, but I will endeavor tonight, perhaps too much, to try to present the Russian perspective as well. I think a beginning framing point of talking about Putin's Russia is to acknowledge the fact I can only speak, even as a historian who endeavors to look at things objectively, through an American-centric lens. There are moments tonight where I will make argumentative points about Putin, but I'll try to stop and think, what might Putin say back? How might he respond? What might be a different Russian framing of the events that we're talking about? To introduce myself briefly, I appreciated Caitlin's nice introduction. I am Brandon Gauthier, teach for Fordham as well as the Derryfield School. If you are, the end of tonight, interested in what I've had to say, I would steer you towards my book, Before Evil. It is about the early lives of some of the worst despots of the 20th century. Because there's a question that keeps me up at night, and I think it always will. It makes sense if we frame the meaning of evil actions, crimes against humanity, horrific things that other people do to other people, as about people being evil. This is an explanatory concept. How do we define evil? A lack of feeling for someone else. You don't feel empathy for this situation. This is something that either you want to do or think must be done. But what has always bothered me as I've studied history is the more I looked at the worst dictators of the 20th century, the more disturbed I was to find that they didn't view themselves as evil at all. In the point of view of Joseph Stalin or Hitler or Mao or Vladimir Lenin, in their mind, there are times they also literally say, these things are disturbing or very hard, but this is what we have to do. That's what I don't get. That's what really bothers me. How can insanely, and I say insanely in the sense that it's to the point of irrationality. Example, that at the end of World War II, Hitler and the Nazi Third Reich, the regime, continued to prioritize the mass murder of innocent people, of Jewish men and women and children across Europe, even as Germany was on the brink of defeat against the Soviet Union. They prioritized this insane, irrational, ideological goal of mass murder of a group of people, even over the survival of the country they claim to represent. It is a point which should keep you up at night as well, because at the core of this is this discussion of ideas. How do we frame right and wrong? And how can leaders do the most unthinkably evil things, unquestionably evil things, but not with the conviction that what they're doing is evil, but This is what must be done, which will bring us to Putin. This particular book frames the early lives of these dictators and some of the things that they all have in common and things that we might not expect. Tonight's presentation draws on a number of different sources, but I just wanted to state up front, if you're really interested in this presentation, you want to go deeper, I would recommend these books as a good starting place. These are well-written histories, but also written in the context of popular history, so they're accessible. This book by Philip Short is about 10,000 pages long, but it's a goodie. It's really about 800 pages long. This book by Philip Short, I think, endeavors, perhaps to a fault, to be fair to Vladimir Putin. Define that as you will. So these are some of the framing sources. Okay, the first thought of the night. Is Vladimir Putin a tyrant? And how might Putin respond to this question? Now, I'm going to call on some of you, but you don't have to talk to me. That's the beauty of this. You can just say, and I'll leave you alone, all right? But if you want to talk to me, all the better. And online, I invite you to respond in the chat. And what's going to happen tonight is there'll be moments I'll ask a question for you to think about. And as I do ask that question for you to think about, I'll give you about 30 or 60 seconds at time. So this is my first question to you. Is Vladimir Putin a tyrant? And perhaps maybe a better way of saying this would be, what is a tyrant? How do we define that phrase? What is a tyrant? Take 30 seconds and think about this. Online, please feel free to throw your ideas in the chat. Is Vladimir Putin a tyrant? Or if you prefer not to that question, what is a tyrant? What does that mean, literally? Cynthia says yes. Cynthia, can you tell us why? And anyone in the crowd, does anyone want to speak? You don't have to, of course. Is Vladimir Putin a tyrant? Please.
Yes, he is.
Yes, he is. How come? How do we define that? And by the way, put my cards on the table. I would agree, and I'm going to make that argument tonight. But I also invite everyone to frame it as you see. You don't have to agree with us. You can frame it as you see. What makes Vladimir Putin a tyrant?
Because everything is his way. He's supposedly had elections, but he's always the winner each time. Makes you wonder how many people vote, and regardless of how many people vote, but ahead of time, everyone knows he will be the winner.
Putin always seems to come out on top.
Doesn't he?
Yeah. And if we define tyranny, let's break this down more specifically, if we will. Second. We might say cruel and oppressive government or rule. A nation under a cruel and oppressive government, but to be more specific, tyranny we might think of as cruel, unreasonable, or arbitrary use of power or control. Vladimir Putin would not agree with this. Here are some ways I think we might think about Putin as a tyrant. Then we'll begin to think about how he probably views himself and how many Russians might view him. Well, one, criticizing Putin is just a really bad idea. Those who have been outspoken in challenging Putin's rule have had unbelievably bad things happen to them. And we can put Putin's tyranny, as I argue it, it's in a totally different context than like Joseph Stalin's. The level of Stalinist tyranny is a different universe of bad. But in Putin's Russia, the level of violence, by the way, isn't always even necessary. There's a self-perpetuating understanding. If I speak out too much, I'm crossing a line, and what follows from there is going to be negative. In Stalinist Russia, that looks like someone this doesn't have the thud I want to have. That's a little better, I guess. But on that sound on your door at 3 a.m. is the scariest sound possible. When the secret police enter, the NKVD, or what would be the KGB, and then you are no longer seen. You're going to disappear into a Byzantine labyrinth of secret police chambers where you're going to be tortured and abused and then ultimately going to be shot. Putin's Russia is capable of that, sure, but that's an extreme. Normally, some type of engagement of this is the problem, we prefer this not to have this happen. Or a prison sentence in Siberia for 10 years seems to have a strong corrective dose for those who would challenge Putin. That being said, as we'll talk about tonight, if we get to it, there are a number of journalists and people who have fallen from the balcony of their building. Perhaps the most famous one is a defector in Britain who was poisoned with polonium, an incredibly rare radioactive isotope that only very few governments would have access to, that while he was having tea or coffee in London, literally the tip of a pen, someone walked by, put it into his drink, and that was that. He was dead within weeks after that. So in one sense, we could argue that Putin is a tyrant because he has those who oppose him killed. We could also make the argument that an unjustified invasion of another sovereign nation that results in hundreds of thousands of deaths is also something representative of tyranny. But no, Vladimir Putin at this point would cackle probably. He'd probably say, that's interesting. You talking about me or George W. Bush? Of course, many Americans would resent or disagree with that inference about Bush, and they would have the right to do that. But Putin would challenge all of this. Am I a tyrant? Do I use cruel and unreasonable or arbitrary power? No. What I do is for a reason. I seek the prosperity and power of the Russian state. And Putin would surely point to his high popularity ratings within Russia. Though, as we've discussed, speaking out negatively about Putin is probably not in your best interest. And the Russian state media is controlled by the government themselves. Every single thing you're hearing in the media is essentially checked off on by the regime of Vladimir Putin. There are exceptions when people will challenge that, but again, that is not in your best interest. How does Putin view the Russian state? We can start with this. He said, well, the state should be there as much as necessary, insert for the power of the Russian state, for the security of the Russian government. Freedom should be there as much as required, perhaps for the government to not be overthrown. We can build upon this, but here is the question I would ask you to consider. What is a strong Russian leader? If we were having an honest conversation with Vladimir Putin, he might say, well, what is a good leader of the Russian state? Now, can anyone tell me who some of these individuals are on the screen? All Russian leaders. Yes, we see Gorbachev online. Please feel free to jump in. What did you say? Yeah, Tsar Nicholas II. That's correct. Romanov. Say that one more time. Yeah, also known as Ivan the Terrible. Yeah, thank you. And then Catherine the Great. So we have, who's the one in the top center? That's Peter the Great. Founded the warm water port that we know today is St. Petersburg, or was Leningrad, was Petrograd for a time. Okay, let's play a game, shall we? And right. Actually, let's start with Peter the Great. What made Peter the Great great? He fought numerous wars of successful conquest and expanded the borders of the Russian Empire. He founded the warm water port on the Baltic Sea that we now know as St. Petersburg. But he was a tough ruler, a strong ruler. True story. He had his own kid, Alexei, killed for conspiring against him. Alexei kind of deserved it. If you read the story, Alexei was pretty bad, but he had his own child killed. Here's a fun apocryphal anecdote. Apocryphal meaning that historians are going to ruin it for you. Apocryphal meaning that it's probably not true, but it's a great story that Peter the Great, who was interested in westernizing the Russian state, took a delegation to an autopsy in Paris. And at this autopsy, and this we're talking, late 1600s, early 1700s, the general context of time, these things were just beginning. Members of his delegation were absolutely appalled to see a dead body on a slab being dissected and cut apart for science. And one of them threw up. And that the story goes that Peter the Great was so embarrassed. He turned to the guy and he said, take a bite out of the body. That type of power, absolute power, unquestionable power. Peter the Great ruled that way, even though he is known as a great monarch in Russian history for being successful in many respects, beginning to modernize the Russian state, expanding the power of the state. We could take Catherine the Great as well. Catherine the Great, one of the more important female monarchs of the last 1,000 years, also expands the borders of the Russian state through wars of conquest, is a militarily successful leader known in Russian history for her strength as a leader. Alongside a number of other interesting facts that we could share. All right. Oh, I should have started with this guy. I mean, one of the originators of Muscovy, the very beginnings of an organized Russian state, Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. If you want to lose sleep at night, read about punishments inflicted by Ivan the Terrible on those who had fallen afoul of his good graces. These are the leaders at the top three who are known in Russian history in many respects for having been successful leaders, define that as you will. But at the core of that, strength, unyielding strength, and expanding the power of the Russian state. Now we turn to Tsar Nicholas II. Can anyone tell me about Tsar Nicholas II? He has the unfortunate legacy, the last Romanov emperor. More than 300 years of history of his bloodline ruling Russia, the Romanov dynasty, which was always a bit dysfunctional in certain ways, but you had had moments of great success in Russian history. Nicholas inherits this legacy. And Nicholas comes of age at a time of turmoil for Russia, another period of attempted modernization. His grandfather is killed by assassins. His father is very stern and tough. Tsar Nicholas II, for lack of better words, is kind of a nice guy. He writes lovely love letters to his wife, Alexandra. He is a good husband. He is a good father who cares deeply about his country. But ultimately, how does Nicholas meet his end? Does anyone know how Nicholas meets his end? What's your name again? You got this. What's your name, sir? Yes, you, sir, yes. How does Nicholas II meet his end? He is shot, correct. Now, a couple students who've just joined us who have studied this, how exactly, Mr. Peters, is Nicholas II shot? How? Because this is important. If Putin were here, I imagine he would emphasize this. What kind of leader would you have me be? Let's look at those who failed to be strong in Russian history. And I'm not endorsing this, but I'm trying to frame to you what I think, how I presume, based on the evidence, Putin might respond. Mr. Peters, how was Tsar Nicholas II killed?
Shot to death by the Bolsheviks.
Yes, but it's even worse than that. With whom was he shot to death by the Bolsheviks? His entire family. His entire family was taken to a basement and told that their reign was over, and then were brutally, brutally murdered. His daughters and his son were murdered after he was shot. His wife is doing the sign of the cross. She is murdered. And then the children are shot and stabbed to death. It's unbelievably awful. That's what happened to Tsar Nicholas II. Oh, and Imperial Russia collapsed into Bolshevik rule and a civil war that would kill millions of Russian citizens, create suffering in Russia that's hard to imagine, including cannibalism, widespread starvation and deprivation, to be followed by the decades of Bolshevik rule and communist authoritarianism within Russia and what would be the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev on the right, the last leader of that state, the Soviet Union, has a strong quality with Tsar Nicholas II, and that Gorbachev, whatever this means, is a good person, was a good person. And that the state that Gorbachev inherited, he's the successor to Stalin and so on. He said, we can't go on living like this. We have to find a way to liberalize the Soviet state. Can we find a way to balance communism with democracy? Or at least some liberalization of the country so it doesn't violate human rights abuses. Putin will say that what Gorbachev does leads to the worst catastrophe of the 20th century. In so many words, I paraphrase. By the way, it was a heck of a century. Pretty wild comment for Putin to say, the worst catastrophe of the 20th century. The biggest geopolitical disasters, collapse of the Soviet Union in a century full of a number of doozies, to say the least, including Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, where 40 million people starved to death. Putin says it was Soviet Union's collapse, because what the collapse was not just the Soviet Union, but a broader sphere of Russian power, and that Gorbachev's efforts to liberalize the system, to rule in a different way, that what this had done was only bring about the collapse of the system. So now we come back to, is Putin a tyrant? I imagine if he would say, Those in Russian history who have ruled as you would presume to have me rule have not lasted long. They have brought absolute chaos and disaster to Russia. And in his mind, a leader has to rule a certain way within the Russian state. And now we have a conundrum. I do not and will not accept that it is some type of cultural reality for a given country where human rights, as we understand them, the right to life, liberty, and property, the pursuit of happiness, property. Putin would say these are American values. Don't push your values on us. I would say that the right to life, to not be murdered by the state, should be a universal human value. The Russian response would be, don't lecture me or lecture our country on the values of a state that is centuries old. And Putin would probably go on further. Well, you would presume to have us be a democracy, like Russia in the 1990s, when it was chaos and lawlessness and corruption was widespread. The democracy you push leads to chaos. And he would surely probably bring up Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or Libya, in the sense that Putin has not only advocated for a Russian state rooted in his authority, which is, I would call tyrannical, he would call strong. He has viewed what we view as being democratic human rights as being a terrible idea. And this brings us to a larger issue of the Russian point of view, if you will, or a Chinese point of view, that our ideological values are probably not going to last. The presumption would be your state is doomed to chaos, that this can't work, this notion of permanent democratic governance. You're doomed to instability. I reject this. But Putin, when he takes power, as we will hear, takes a very different approach. He, after coming to power in the year 2000, visits Columbia University. And here's a framing point for this. A professor at Columbia asked Putin, I wanted to ask Putin sort of indirectly, are you becoming authoritarian? A professor at Barnard College, former director, asked him. The question was, your detractors would accuse you of limiting freedom of the press and political association. How would you respond to your detractors? His reply really surprised me. It was, of course we limit freedom of the press. When the press had freedom, it was chaos. You in the West, you forget you've had democracy for hundreds of years. We need time to catch up, which I've got to give him credit for his honesty. If I could engage Putin, I would say state-run media is only going to breed corruption and inefficiency if nobody can raise their hand and say the truth that something is bad. It's only going to reinforce an authoritarian mode that keeps getting worse and worse and worse. I argue that a state lacking in democratic representation, that we're going to kill those who have the audacity to be brave enough to speak their mind and say, this is wrong. I don't agree. I find that to be abhorrent. From the Russian perspective, and I say Russian perspective carefully in that there are millions of Russians with many different views, but from the general view of the state, oh, that is a silly point of view. That is naive. Here's a question for you. Should we be allowed to mock leaders? Should media be allowed to make fun of the president or senators or any state leader? In China, if you try to look up Xi Jinping and Winnie the Pooh, it's like a big thing. You're not allowed to do that. There was a meme that went viral among young Chinese people. It was funny that Xi Jinping, the leader of China, looked like Winnie the Pooh. That was not funny to the Chinese state. And you literally can't do it. You have to use a VPN within China to be able to access, because it would be blocked within the Chinese internet. Now, I might say, oh my gosh, don't we have more important things to worry about? Surely the leader is secure and confident enough to say, you make fun of me, I don't care, I'm the leader. So, say what you want, but I'm the one in control, whether I look like Winnie the Pooh or not. No, it won't be tolerated. So I want to show you a clip that is a continuing framing of this discussion. After Vladimir Putin came to power, he came to power in a Russia that was democratic for a time. The 1990s, however corrupt, did see real elections, the possibility of real democracy taking root. And with that came, for a time, genuine freedom of the press. And in the year 2000, when Putin took power, you could still make fun of him. You could still mock him. And this is like a fever dream. This is like it's 3 in the morning and you have a fever, this show. This is very odd. There was a puppet show that took liberty to make fun of Vladimir Putin. I'm going to play that for you now. The context is Putin has just taken power. He's inherited power from Boris Yeltsin, the prior president. So it's going to show baby Putin, representative of him, he's about to become president. And it's showing Putin thinking about, what have I given birth to?
Ох, да чего же он непривлекательный, а? Ну и происхождение, прости, Господи, темное, и взгляд. Ох, не, ну взгляды-то есть, ну какие-то мутные. Ай, Господи, ну почему у меня, демократа до мозга, костей под конец, родилось именно это, а?
Your earlier leaders that you thought could succeed you were prettier.
Они же мне все разонравились, вот я и родил этого.
Сердцу не прикажешь.
Ну, мне тем более. А ты кто?
Если честно, то фея. Очень добрая.
Надо же. Ну...
Наградим его орденом зеленого пятнистого тигра!
На 4 года!
Благодарный горожан. Прощай.
Presenting the idea of Putin as a puppet.
Улицам ходила большая крокодила. Она зеленая была.
So this came on late night television and was very funny to a number of people. How do you think Putin responded to this? Not well. He called the head of the channel in and he said, the show is over. The show is over. And within 6 months, the state took over control of the channel. In Putin's mind, this cannot be allowed. The ability to challenge the authority of the leader through mocking them like this is the first step to becoming like Nicholas. It's more complicated than that, but that in so many words is the gist. Here's how Putin, when they're running the media, wants to be seen. This was a signal to what happens to those who fall foul of Putin. Here's the context. Putin is responding. There is corruption in a given factory, and Putin is blaming the billionaires for not giving, I think, fair treatment to the workers. So he is going to swoop in and save the day and force the billionaire owner of these factories to sign a deal.
Vladimir Putin strode into town.
Почему раньше здесь не было людей, которые способны были принимать решения? Почему здесь-то забегали все как тараканы перед самым моим приездом?
Unlike Medvedev, Putin confronted the factory owners.
Считаю, что вы сделали заложниками своих амбиций, непрофессионализма, а может быть просто и тривиальной жадности. Тысячи людей. Это абсолютно недопустимо. Если собственники договориться между собой не смогут, то единый комплекс все равно будет восстановлен. В том или в другом виде, то это будет сделано без вас. Пожалуйста.
He demanded the owners, including billionaire Oleg Deripaska, sign an undertaking to restart the factories.
Вы подписали этот договор? Да. Олег Владимирович подписал? Что я не вижу вашей подписи? Идите, пишите. Идите ко мне. Куда договор? Только второчку у меня, видите?
Classic Putin. But if a country as big as Russia needed a person
Give me back my pen. Oh my God. This is how he wants to be seen. And by the way, why do you think he invited? Why are the cameras there in the first place? He's going to make an example of this factory owner. And so this is what he thinks a leader should be. A leader in this case should be willing to go in and bully people. When the war in Ukraine was just about to begin, and I cannot lament enough the enormous suffering wrought by Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of lives. I mourn the loss of Ukrainian lives. I mourn the loss of Russian lives. It's horrible. That right now there are men and women sitting in trenches, constantly listening for that buzz of a drone. I don't want to imagine what it's like, but it's bad. It's really bad. So before the invasion, Vladimir Putin invited his ministers and gave them the opportunity to speak their mind about what was going to follow. Putin was dissatisfied when one of his ministers seemed less than enthusiastic about the possibility of invading Ukraine. It's said in so many words here.
Таким образом, согласился бы с предложением Николая Платоновича о том, что нашим, так сказать, западным партнерам...
So he's basically saying, and this is all being filmed, it's all for the media, we should try a negotiation one more time. Anything to avoid. And in a sense, this man, thank goodness he's saying what he's saying. He's cognizant a lot of people are about to die. That's not Putin's perspective. He thinks this war is going to be easy. How does Putin respond?
Последний шанс с тем, чтобы предложить им в кратчайшие сроки заставить Киев пойти на мир и выполнить Минские соглашения. В противном случае мы должны принять то решение, о котором сегодня говорится.
Что значит, в противном случае вы предлагаете начать переговорный процесс?
Нет, я...
Или признавать суверенитет их?
А я поддержу...
Говорите прямо.
Я поддержу предложение о признании...
Поддержу или поддерживаю? Говорите прямо, Сергей.
Поддерживаю предложение...
Так и скажите, да или нет?
Да. Поддерживаю предложение о вхождении Донецкой и Луганской народных республик в состав Российской Федерации.
Да, мы об этом не говорим, мы этого не обсуждаем. Мы говорим о признании их независимости или нет.
Да, я поддерживаю предложение о признании независимости.
Хорошо, пожалуйста, садитесь. Спасибо.
I mean, at that point, say anything. Please stop hazing me in front of the cameras. What's at stake there? In one sense, could Putin have this guy killed? Yeah, sure, but that's an extreme of all of your livelihood, all of your wealth. There are in between violently hurting someone in Putin's Russia. But in this case, this is how he thinks the leader should rule. My argument is this dooms Russia. Tyranny propagates rot. Nobody wants to say the truth. You want to say what the leader wants to hear. And all leaders, no matter who they are fallible. If nobody can challenge the leader, what you're doing is off. I'm sorry, allow me to speak plainly. You're not right on this. And at least have the leader entertain that. This is not a good thing. So this is the type ruler Putin is. He rejects my opening premise that he is a tyrant. I hope you can appreciate where he would come from in his ideas, whether we agree with them or not. He in no way thinks he is evil or that what he has done is wrong. He is continuing a legacy. He could reference to Peter the Great or Catherine the Great through the invasion of Ukraine. That's how he would like to be remembered. And now we turn to little Vladimir Vladimirovich. I give you a minute here. What type of childhood do you presume that Vladimir Putin had? I'll give you 30 seconds. Online, if you would like to play the game, please speak in the comments or put your comments in the chat. Any guesses? What type of childhood did Vladimir Putin have? Would anyone like to play? Mr. Lewis, or yes, please. Were you going to say anything? There's no...
A normal Soviet or post-Soviet childhood where everything is constrained.
Well, this is a very thoughtful point. This is a very thoughtful point. It's a normal childhood.
Well, I have been there as a tourist,
Mm,
and I have been married to a Czech citizen during the time of communism.
mm,
So, I know some aspects of the mentality of the people who live in the systems.
mm. So the notion of tightly controlled, constricted,
Auto censorship.
that's a really well said, auto censorship. When I'm talking about the idea of state violence, again, that's an extreme. The more is when you propagate it yourself. You know what you can say and can't say. The state doesn't have to kill you because you police yourself. This is common. But hold on, online, Marcia said one of neglect. And Carmen said tough to visualize the kind of person he's become. I would agree, Carmen. But this is where we tend to miss a larger point. Our presumption, which makes sense to me, is that those who commit crimes as adults probably had terrible childhoods. Maybe they were abused, they were mistreated. But that's not true for Vladimir Putin at all. He had a Soviet childhood, meaning his family didn't have great means, but he had a wonderful mother and father. His father had fought in the Second World War at the Battle of Leningrad, had been terribly wounded, had been sent basically on almost a certain death mission and had somehow survived. He'd had two older brothers who had perished, including one during the war. He was the only child of the family, and his mother and father absolutely adored him. Adored him like parents who knew what it means to lose a child. They loved them. They loved him. They were all in on Vladimir. And so he grew up in a home that really sought to give him whatever they could, meaning that his father is perhaps more lenient with Vladimir than he might otherwise have been. Because what was Vladimir Putin like as a child? Same characteristics that he has today, which disconcert me. He never backed down from a fight. Putin was known in the housing building where he lived, right? So picture big Soviet housing, tons of apartments. The courtyard, Putin was not a big kid, but he never backed down physically. But those who knew him as a child described him as somebody as once he committed to a fight, he would not stop. He'd take the fight to the end. And Putin has recalled as an adult something he learned in the courtyards growing up in the Soviet Union, or where he grew up in Leningrad, St. Petersburg. They would get bored, and one time he cornered a rat. He cornered a rat because he was being a stupid kid. But what he remembered at that moment was the moment that he had this rat cornered and he could do with it what he pleased, the rat attacked him. The rat went at him hard, ran up his leg. So he's running, we're trying to get away from this rat. Putin learned in a moment like that, you fight to the absolute death. He'd cornered the rat. The rat was not going to give in. It was going to attack with everything it had, even if it was going to die. Putin learned in that moment, don't back down, even facing difficult circumstances. If I were advising the US president or anyone in power dealing with Putin, I would advise them that that's how he views himself based on his childhood. The problem with the war in Ukraine, Putin views it as a life and death thing for Russia at this point. We cannot give in. No matter what it takes. Hundreds of thousands of Russians are dead. It has been an epic disaster. They've conquered 20% of the country. The expectation was they would conquer the whole country within weeks. Putin's not going to give in. I don't know what peace looks like, but I do know it's not an ideal circumstance. As a kid, he was also known, as I've already said, for getting in fights. He was unruly. He got in trouble in school. He had a hard time joining the youth communist organization, the Pioneers, because he got in trouble a lot at school. But one thing he did excel at as a boy was martial arts. He became deeply involved in that, and he was a prominent athlete as a child. So Putin, mom and dad, it was actually pretty good. When the family won a car at one point through a state lottery system, which was so weird that people asked, was his dad actually in the KGB or something? But the family won a car. They immediately gave it to Vladimir. He received the best of what the family had. And maybe what we take away from this is that Again, Putin doesn't view himself as the villain. He had a mom and dad who built him up. You could do great things. You're special. As a child and as a teenager growing up, he fell in love with a movie called The Sword and the Shield. And there's also a book. And what this was about were, really courageous KGB agents, spies for Russia who saved the day, who benefited the Russian state. Courage, audacity, action. And Putin, from a teenager, began to view himself in that light. Could I be that person for Russia? Could that be me? Which now brings us to the question of what Putin's future was going to be in Leningrad. He actually, as a teenager, went to the KGB's offices and asked to speak to someone and said, I would like to volunteer for the KGB. At which point, sometimes Russian kids who were really overzealous did this. But that'd be like me showing up to the CIA and being like, actually, it wouldn't be like me because I'm an adult. Picture a teenager showing up to the CIA and be like, I would like to be a spy, please. So they had an officer who took him aside, sat him down. Thank you for your enthusiasm. That's not how this works. You don't come to us. We come to you. To which Putin responded, well, what do I need to do? And they said, well, the best thing you could do, go to law school. It's one of the hardest schools to get into in the country. Go to Leningrad State University, go to law school. This would be the best chance you have. And at this point, Putin pursues that path and he succeeds in ultimately being brought into the KGB out of Leningrad State University and ultimately being able to join. But Putin's spy dreams are soon crushed. To actually get to go to America and be a spy, this is a tiny grouping of people. This is not normal. Putin is ultimately sent to East Germany, Dresden, where he serves as a KGB agent. And as John McCain once said, George W. Bush, in some unfortunate comments, had once met with Vladimir Putin, and he said, forgive my southern accent, I'm from Louisiana, so I'm going to use a slight southern accent. I looked into his eyes, and I got a sense of the man's soul, which John McCain said, a late Arizona Republican senator, when I look in Vladimir Putin's eyes, I see three things, three letters, K, G, B. When Putin met with George W. Bush, Putin told him a story. One of my houses had burned down. And when the house burned down, I only found this cross remaining. It was the only thing I found in the ashes. A cross that was given to me in my baptism, going back to my childhood. Putin knew that Bush was an evangelical Christian. Any engagement with Putin, it's not that the man can't be authentic. He has authentic viewpoints. You're being gamed. He's a trained spy. He's been professionally trained to deceive you. He's extremely good at it. He knows how to appeal to your weaknesses. This doesn't mean that you can't negotiate with him. You certainly can. And I'm not saying that diplomacy with Russia is not vital or more important than ever. It is. But dealing with Putin one-on-one and thinking you're having an honest conversation is a fool's errand, whether it be Barack Obama or George W. Bush or Donald Trump, whoever is president. And presidents realize this, I pray, to some extent. They have advisors. Condoleezza Rice to George W. Bush, when he said, I got a sense of the man's soul, was mortified. Like, very quickly engaged the president. Like, you're seeing the side of him he wants you to see. So there's no doubt in today's White House, people are telling the president that. And your presidents are being advised of this, right? So this is a reality of dealing with power. But there is one thing I want you to know before we move into Putin's rise to power. It was in Dresden in the last days of the Soviet Union. So this actually goes back to 1989. Here he is a few years later, so you get a sense of what he looks like at this point. He's posted in Dresden. The Berlin Wall has fallen in November 1989. Communist East Germany is about no longer to exist. East Germans ripping down the Berlin Wall. In Dresden, a separate city from Berlin, obviously, they gathered around the KGB headquarters and were threatening to storm the building. And Putin speaks to this still today as a life-changing event for him. And by the way, it's 6:48. I have till 7. Is that correct? Okay, great. All right, 7. Great. I have approximately 5 more hours of material planned. I realize that you might leave at some point, All right, so maybe 7:15, then we'll take questions, but 7:30 is no problem. But you may not want to be here until 7:30, so we'll see. Putin says a life-changing event for him was this. Picture this building surrounded by angry Germans who are demanding to know what this KGB headquarters in Dresden is up to. Putin remembers calling Moscow repeatedly. What do we do? What do we do? And when the phone is dialed to Moscow, it just rings. Nobody answers the phone. That had a deep impact on him. A weak state, a state without firm leadership, a state in its final days, that ringing phone. There was nobody to help. There was nobody to inform him of what to do. What follows, we're not exactly sure about it, but I'll tell you Putin's version of the story. Putin's version of the story is, I went out, I confronted the crowds and told them, this is Soviet territory. There are people with guns. If you try to storm this building, you're going to be shot. I am not bluffing. This is the reality. His version of the story is he faced down the crowds. To some extent, this is true, but he always romanticizes it more. But what stood out to him, what would always stick in his memory, that ringing telephone. Putin views himself as a leader who's going to be the opposite of Gorbachev. So here's what's crazy, that from the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, he's 38 years old, a middling KGB agent. What do I mean by middling? He's successful. He made it into the KGB. That was an amazing accomplishment. He made it into law school. He had been a successful person, but he's not a genius or anything. It wasn't like he was like the top of the KGB. How, in 9 years, does he go from being a 38-year-old, now the Soviet Union's collapsing, to being president of Russia? That is a wild transition in the story of Vladimir Putin's life. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of democratic Russia. Putin laments this as being, I already said, the greatest disaster of the 20th century. That ringing telephone, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which consists of states like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, all these Soviet socialist republics seceding. And there's no effort by the state to stop so. And with this, Russian power collapses. Putin will remember the 1990s as a time of lawlessness in Russia. And to some extent, this is true. How were Russian public school teachers paid at one point in Russia in the 1990s? With vodka. A common memory is seeing school teachers who've worked all day in train stations trying to sell vodka to tourists. Is it terrible? And this is a fact. It's a terrible period of suffering for the Russian people. That economically, poverty skyrocketed. I remember being in Lithuania and I was talking with someone about, like, tell me about the Soviet Union. And one thing she said was, it wasn't all bad. There's grave restrictions on freedom, but everyone mostly had a place to live. For some decades, people always had enough to eat. There's exceptions to this under Stalin, obviously, in other times, but there was a certain baseline of guaranteed livability, even if it was some degree of impoverishment, but you had an apartment. There was some basic line there, right? In the 1990s, all of that is swept aside. It's a difficult time post-communism. Putin remembers this era of democracy as a disaster. More than that, who caused this? Not just Gorbachev, the Americans who fought for decades to weaken us. They wanted to break up the Soviet Union. They wanted to bring us to our knees, and we let it happen. And they rejoiced. The United States maybe could have made some different decisions in the 1990s, but the Russian perspective was, you rejoiced at our downfall. You were triumphant, but you forgot that we are strong people and that we would come back. So Putin views the 90s disaster, but he finds a job. He ends up going to work for the person who becomes his mentor, Anatoly Sobchak. Sobchak, a prominent academic, is looking for somebody from the KGB to join his team. Putin in Leningrad State University in law school had known Sobchak. And he would say, oh, this is why Sobchak asked me. That's not really true. Sobchak had hundreds of students. He probably didn't remember Putin. But he did, in so many words, ask through, I would like someone from that team, if you will, on my team, someone who's a KGB insider could advise me. But what he found in Putin was an effective and intelligent person. Putin serving on Sobchak's team becomes vital. And this is the first step towards the presidency. Putin basically acts as deputy mayor. That's not his title, but Putin has the job of basically running the city government for Sobchak. What does that look like? Picture having to deal with mafiosos coming in wanting a grain deal or a timber deal. It's Putin who has to sit across the table and negotiate these agreements. And there are occasions where agreements with foreign entities for food for Leningrad, which becomes St. Petersburg again, the food never arrives, but there are vast sums of money that go missing. It raises the question, is Putin dirty? Is he corrupt? And the book by Philip Short made a really interesting point about this. In Putin's mind, to be dirty is to take a bribe. He says he doesn't take bribes. He doesn't believe in quid pro quos. That the Russian measurement of corruption is a little different from ours. A quid pro quo, you offer me money for something. Putin says, well, this just denigrates me. This makes me your lackey. I won't do that. But how it works is, I'm going to entertain your request. Perhaps I will give you what you want. Maybe I won't. But if I do give you what you want, you had sure as better take care of me. This is a matter of course. And this is how corruption is often working in Russia. It's not overt quid pro quos, but it is part of the system. If I give you what you want, then I should get a cut later on. Putin, as deputy mayor, so to speak, quote unquote, is part of that system. But in his mind, he'd say, this isn't corruption. This is how business works in Russia. I don't take bribes. I don't want people to take bribes. But of course, when you do someone a good favor, they're going to help you out back. So Putin comes of age, if you will, as an adult, really, in his 40s, serving beneath Sobchak. What distinguishes him, though, most of all, is that he is loyal. He's seen as loyal and reliable. And he loves Sobchak. Putin is not known for being an emotional man. But he, as he recalls Sobchak, and by the way, right now, he's actually at odds with Sobchak's daughter. He has split hairs with. But when he speaks about the memory of Sobchak, this gives you an idea about how he speaks about his memory.
Dear friends, we have gathered here today to honor the memory of Anatoly Alexandrovich Sobchak. He became the first mayor of St. Petersburg at the peak of his nationwide and truly national fame. That is exactly how he was, brilliant, extraordinary, to his university colleagues and, of course, to us, his students, among whom I was also one. Being a professor, a teacher, and a top-class lawyer, he won the elections and literally burst into politics. Upon becoming a people's deputy of the Soviet Union, he immediately made a name for himself across the country as a brilliant orator and
he loves this man. But it's Sobchak who really gives him his start. And the first step towards Putin becoming who he's going to become is serving within Sobchak's administration. But Sobchak was at odds with Boris Yeltsin. And this is going to lead us to how does he go from being essentially a number two in a big city to being president of the country. The major step towards that, how does Putin go from deputy mayor, that's not his real title, but that's the easiest way of understanding it. He's basically running the administration, to president. But by the way, look at this claim, or look at this climb to power. So he goes from being the number two in St. Petersburg, deputy chief of the presidential administration. Sobchak, by the way, lost an election because Russia was a democracy for a time. Sobchak gets pushed out of power. Putin appeals to friends in Moscow, give me a job. By the way, at this point, he could have gone a completely different path. He could have been a businessman. They didn't know he was going to be president of the country, but he reaches out to buddies in Moscow. I need a job. Please put me in the game. And he ends up becoming deputy chief of the presidential administration. So he ends up getting an administration job for Boris Yeltsin. Here was the decisive moment, though, for Vladimir Putin and Yeltsin's administration. Sobchak had run afoul of Yeltsin's administration, and Sobchak was in trouble. Vladimir Putin left his desk, left his job, and went to help Sobchak. And in the moment, he said to his supervisor, the person above him, I have to help him. I realize this might have negative consequences for me, but this is something I have to do. And actually, to the contrary, the fact that Putin risked his career to help his mentor, this is one of the most vital things, not the vital, but it's an important part of how this begins. He's perceived by Yeltsin and those above him. This person's loyal. He took a risk. We like that. And it actually ends up paying great dividends for him, which is how he begins this remarkable rise to fame, if you will. I should also add, he's competent. He is competent in the sense also, if you think about the stereotypes of Russia, Putin doesn't like drinking. He is sober, literally and metaphorically, calm, quiet, keeps his emotions to himself. He is a KGB agent. He's also known in that context. And this is how he ends up being appointed director of what is the successor to the KGB, the Federal Security Service, also known as the FSB. Putin goes from having been a middling KGB officer by 1998. He is appointed by Yeltsin to run the successor to the KGB. This is a big deal. It's at this point that he continues this rise. Boris Yeltsin, by the end of the 20th century, is reading the writing on the wall. He has extreme health problems. He's looking to leave power. But this was an unanswered question. How would democratic succession in Russia work? Who would follow? Yeltsin ultimately looks to a number of different successors who he finds to be unimpressive. He has a number of different prime ministers, but in Putin, he sees a competent person. Putin first becomes head of the FSB, but then Putin puts him in the role of prime minister. He does this because this was the grooming role. The first step towards becoming president, run the administration as prime minister, and we'll see how you do. But at this point, it's hard to imagine that Putin could have imagined he was going to be president. He could not have imagined it was going to happen. But what's wild about this is Boris Yeltsin lifts him into the office. In the months before the year 2000, Yeltsin calls him to the office and says, I'm not finishing my term. I'm going to retire. And you're going to replace me. And it's at that moment that the recognition comes over Putin that he is going to be in charge. As a deputy, intensely loyal, and he says to Yeltsin at this point, Yeltsin says, are you up to this? And he says, I will do whatever is asked of me. He says, do you understand what I'm asking you? And at this point, the recognition comes over Putin that he is going to be the one who's going to take control. And Yeltsin tells him, you will take power New Year's Eve. On the year 2000, Russia will have a new leader. Yeltsin gives an address where he tells the Russian people, I'm sorry that we couldn't make your dreams come true. We'd had such lofty ambitions for a free Russia, but I understand things have been hard. But Yeltsin sees in Putin someone who can continue the succession of power, but perhaps Yeltsin sees in power someone who he would be safe leaving in power. How do you be a leader who retires and not know that your successor is going to come after you? The vision is Putin is going to be trustworthy, that Putin is not going to turn on Yeltsin. But what Yeltsin prioritizes in that moment is someone who is known as loyal, perhaps more than he is known for being a democratic official. Putin's first words in power, beyond that midnight speech.
Russia. Dear friends, today I address you, precisely you, because you have entrusted me with the highest state office in the country. I understand that I have taken on immense responsibility, and I know that in Russia, the head of state has always been and will always be the person who answers for everything that happens in the country. The first president of Russia, Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin, reminded us of this today as he left the Kremlin. He spoke words that many will remember. Today, in this hall, he repeated, "Take care of Russia." This precisely is what I see as the primary duty of the president.
So, looking back towards the beginning, I think Putin has crossed lines where what he has done is evil. A gross lack of empathy for his fellow man and woman. He has caused suffering for hundreds of thousands of people. It is deplorable and abhorrent. Putin does not agree with this at all. Putin would say, what I am doing is projecting power for a strong Russian state. And Putin would make the argument that, of course, you would disagree. The United States wants to see Russia weak. The United States wants Russia to decline and break up. And Putin would say in this regard, this is a continuation of the past. What Putin wants is for us to break up. Putin wants the United States to go through a process like the Soviet Union went through. But in his mind, he is serving the broader interest of Russia. Now, we think about this war in Ukraine, but I would remind you that all of this is played out pretty quickly after he takes power. That after taking power, and actually had been unfolding as he was prime minister, a war in Chechnya, a tiny breakaway republic in the Caucasus bordering Georgia, that Putin in this case said in agreement with Yeltsin, there had been a war there in the mid-1990s, must be part of Russia. There are Islamist radicals there who want to establish a caliphate or an Islamic state there. Putin unleashes a war there that is unbelievably awful. The conflict that follows sees Putin also project a new form of Russian power. When he's in front of the media and they ask him, how will you respond in Chechnya? And he says, I'm going to kill the terrorist. And there were horrendous apartment bombings in Moscow that killed several hundred people that were blamed on Chechen terrorists. There is a conspiracy theory that Putin's FSB actually did the bombings themselves. That is an unconfirmed allegation. But Putin is in front of the media and they say, how will you respond to the war in Chechnya? And he projects the tough guy image. I'm going to kill the terrorists wherever they are. I'm going to kill them in the shithouse if necessary. And he curses in front of the media like that. And the bravado, the machismo is widely popular in Russia. But he projects this image of strength after a time of weakness. How does Russia's war in Chechnya unfold? Like it's unfolded in Ukraine. It's not particularly complicated. We're going to use overwhelming force and grind cities into dust. Chechnya, the capital Grozny, at one point they declare, as this is unfolding in the year 2000, anybody left in Grozny will be killed. At which point the United States and other countries begged them to stop because there were hundreds of thousands of elderly and children there. And they said, okay, well, we'll back up a little. But then they proceeded to grind the city into dust and waged a horrendous war. And then they put a petite Putin, if you will, in power. Kadyrov, who's still in power today, who rules just like Putin does in Russia, but he essentially is told, do what you want within Chechnya, rule as tough as you want, but there's no question about who's ultimately in power within Russia. In Kadyrov's war, Putin's war sees great atrocities committed. Here's an upsetting excerpt that is from the war in Chechnya that a muckraking journalist brings to the public's attention. A Chechen kid. I was glad when they took us to be shot. Mohammed Agadov, a 16-year-old 10th grader at his village's high school number 2, has the eyes of a grown-up man. Combined with his teenage angular build and awkwardness, this looks strange. During the 20th purge, they tortured him, Russian troops, with electric shocks at the temporary filtration point set up at the edge of a village along with adult men. This is happening right now in Ukraine. Right now. They call it calling Putin. Military forces have the wind-up phones. They know how to administer that. They attach that to a man's genitals, and they call it, shall we give Putin a call? Russian forces are doing this to Ukrainians right now. It's happening. This was done in Chechnya first, and it is horrendous. Anna Polsk, I'm going to missay her name, Anna Polovitskaya is a journalist who writes for an independent paper within Chechnya about what is happening. Writes in Russia, in St. Petersburg, what is happening. It can only go one way for her. What happens to her? She is shot outside of her apartment building. She is killed. In other cases, there are other terrorist events that follow. And to acknowledge the Russian viewpoint, The war in Chechnya is horrendous. Chechen terrorism does plague Russia in this case. Chechen terrorists storm a theater in Moscow in the year 2002. 40 plus Chechen militants wearing bombs seize a theater doing a play, a musical, and basically broadcast, Russian forces must leave Chechnya or we kill everybody in the theater. Polivatskaya is brought into, as they try to use her and other people to help negotiate. She's not dead at this point. But for Putin, no negotiation. What the Russian state does is it pumps in a chemical gas similar to fentanyl into the theater. And everybody falls asleep. And then once everybody's asleep, Russian special forces storm the theater and they kill all the terrorists. In this sense, a success story. Innocent lives are at stake through people threatening to kill civilians. But typical of the Russian state in this case, they have no ambulances planned. They don't have people on standby to help the hundreds of people who have been knocked out by this chemical gas, because the core goal was kill the terrorist, no mercy. Hundreds of 130 hostages specifically, to be more specific, died mostly from gas used in the storming. Literally, they lay people out in the street. There's not medical professionals there yet. And the state won't reveal to the hospitals what the gas was because it's a state secret. And you have 130 people die needlessly of the gas that the country used to save them. At the same time, you see other really horrendous terrorist attacks that we should mourn for Russia. The Beslan school siege is one of the absolute worst. You had Chechen terrorists seize a school on the first day of school and hold hostage 1,100 people, mostly children and their teachers. The Russian state's response to this, first off, bringing massive military forces. A bomb goes off accidentally that they had attached to a basketball hoop, and then the military storms the school, and it's a total debacle. And you have 334 civilians, including 186 children, who were killed in the fighting that follows. This is unbelievably awful. The premise for the Russian state, though, would be strength. This is horrible. The Russian nation mourns this. I mourn this. This is horrible. But the response of the Russian state was the goal: kill the terrorist. No wavering. Absolute strength. And Russian terrorist leaders in Chechnya, particularly Shamil Basayev and Khattab on the bottom left, who had links to Al-Qaeda, these Chechen insurgent leaders, terrorists, are ultimately killed with enough time. I was in St. Petersburg on the day that they announced the killing of Shamil Basayev. It was a big deal for Russia. The president of the state of Chechnya, who has links to these terrorists, but fancied himself a democratic leader, he is ultimately hunted down and killed. This is the message from Putin's state. Once the fight has begun, there's no stopping. We go to the end, no matter what. And I'm about to stop here in a few minutes and take questions. Those who have challenged the state, like Alexander Litvinenko, who is a former member of the KGB, is the guy in the very beginning I noted who was poisoned through polonium. Yevgeny Prigozhin, who for a short time in 2023 tried to march on Moscow. I couldn't believe this guy. He tries to march on Moscow with the Wagner group and could perhaps have made it. But then Putin strikes a deal with him. Turn around. We'll figure this thing out. Oh my gosh, if I were telling Prigozhin, I don't think you understand what you've done. You've crossed the line. You've got to go to the end, man. He's going to kill. As sure as the sun will rise tomorrow, he is going to kill you. You've crossed the line. Prigozhin struck a deal and backed down, and then his plane fell out of the sky with the deputy commander of the Wagner group, Navalny, Democratic leader, died in prison. Navalny was nearly poisoned and died abroad, and then chose to return to Russia because he thought they were going to get to him no matter what. Oh, by the way, death is the easy part. There's numerous ways they can kill you, not just murdering you, but sometimes they have set up dissidents in sexually embarrassing positions. Why? The message to those who dissent from the state is, not only do you risk being killed, not only do you risk losing everything you have, we will humiliate you in the process. We will go above and beyond to denigrate you. And this has been the message. So we return to this question. Is Vladimir Putin a tyrant? Well, My message is clear, but you are welcome to think for yourself and make up your own mind. I have endeavored throughout this presentation to take seriously the Russian viewpoint. We must listen to the other side in terms of how they ideologically frame what they are. I say in closing that the greatest danger we face is not in dealing with abhorrent tyrants. It's that we should become more like them as we struggle against them. And as we become more like tyrants because it needs to be done, we'll find ourselves saying, yes, so and so is disturbing, but this is what we must do for our cause. And then somewhere along the way, those who once might have lived very different lives perhaps look in the mirror and realize that they have become the monster, so to speak. But of course, it's not me. No, it needed to be done. You don't understand. I was doing what had to be done. But that is something not special to Vladimir Putin. That is a human condition. And we all run the same risk on a small level or a mass level to justify what needs to be done, to begin to make those moral compromises for larger ends. That perhaps is a takeaway. It's 7:15. I will stop there and allow questions if anybody would like to talk.
What about Applebaum? She's a big name in this kind of conversation.
Applebaum is, I think, one of the better scholars. Her book on the famine in Ukraine in the past, I think she has contributed some important viewpoints, and I'd encourage you to continue to read what she says. But if I were here, I would love to ask her, and I can give you my opinion on it, but what is there to do? Because here's the conundrum today. There are those in the current administration who would say Russia has some valid points. We need to try to strike a deal. Ukraine, we're sorry. You're going to have to come to terms of reality. You're not going to win it all back. Strike a deal. But then there are those who would say, so we're going to reward this tyrant for unleashing this war of hundreds of thousands of deaths, to which they might say, we don't like it, but it is what it is. There are those, like say the Biden administration, who basically had said, no compromise. No, we're done compromising. We're going to arm Ukraine to the teeth. But now Putin will say to this, you risk nuclear war. You risk nuclear war. And by the way, Russia's viewpoint would be, we are the source of instability. If I had more time, I would tell you more about it. But Putin would say in 2007, he gave a very important speech in Munich, in which he said, you have been the instigators of instability. It's you who expanded NATO's borders up to the point where we could no longer tolerate it. I would argue that Putin's actions tend to affirm the wisdom of expanding NATO borders, that he sees himself in the context of a Russian monarch to expand the borders of Mother Russia, and that danger remains. If I were in Estonia, I would be nervous. I would genuinely be nervous because it could happen. What would happening look like? Breaking NATO. That's the greatest goal. If we could convince the US president to allow that to happen, where we could take the Baltics, that's dangerous. And I imagine, and I say imagine because I don't know what Putin's thinking, but everything suggests that would be a larger goal. Break NATO. Then we would be free to seize the Baltics potentially. Questions?
Yeah.
Please.
You have presented the political and historical perspective, but there are components that, like the psychological aspect of what is in Putin's mind, his DNA. So he's using the theme of Russia's greatness, but it is only for satisfying his personal greed for power. So he's probably, because of his lack of empathy, to say the least, he's probably autistic or something serious, serious condition that is not in the mainstream. So, and as you said in your presentation, you don't take risks nowhere in criticizing. So the psychological aspect of Putin is rarely addressed. But I think it's an important addition.
Yeah, I think that's well said. There have been books on other leaders where professional psychiatrists or psychologists have looked at their speeches and sought to assess how might they be emblematic of certain pathological or psychological issues or conditions. Historians, I remember getting yelled at in grad school over this. I was thinking about a dissertation topic. So we're talking like 14 years ago, thinking about my dissertation. I was like, what if I did a psychohistory? You know, I began to try to engage the psychoanalytical notion of the leader. My advisor yelled at me and said, this is a terrible idea. He said, because we'd have to, and I think it has its place. I think it's important. But in the context of my expertise, he said, you are not a trained psychotherapist, but even if you were, in the perfect situation, we would need to sit down with them. An expert would need to engage at length. But I also don't find that, I find that a little too pat, right? I think what you're saying has real merit, that this is an important part of the conversation, but there's better people to speak to it than me. I would say, though, on Putin, I often have had this argument with a relative. They say, oh, this is nonsense. He wants to be wealthy. He's corrupt. You know, he wants power, right? Which is true to some extent, right? But here's what's more terrifying. It's when my notion of power, which of course affirms my greatness, right, goes hand in hand with the greatness of the state. That these types of leaders view the two as being intertwined, right? Someone like Joseph Stalin or Hitler, total narcissist, right? I would invite psychotherapists to break that down, but they tend to view their own power as synonymous with the greater good. So in one sense, the notion of they take power for money or influence, these things certainly factor in, of course. But in their minds, the powers, well, I'm the only one who can fix it. If you give me the power, I could actually do what needs to be done. When you look at the larger message of tyranny centered on a cult of personality, it's often rooted in that message. No, but I am the only one who can do this. And Putin's notion of greatness, which I think also does begin to cross into the psychological point of analysis, the sword and the shield, this book he read as a kid in the movie, I could do this. For my book, Before Evil, I go up to that line, but I only speak about what I know for a fact. We know that the leaders of Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Mussolini, Kim, some of these leaders had bad fathers who were abusive. They all had good mothers. They all had really good mothers. Mothers who built them up, who told them they could do great things. So that begins to cross almost to that Freudian point, you know, the parental aspect. But for them, we know this is true for a fact. They would begin to think about it themselves, and you see it in their speeches. Only I can do it. I could fix this. I could do these great things. So I concede the point to you. I concede the point. I think it's an important part of it. But perhaps my historical training has made me overly cautious on this point. I blame my dissertation advisor. Any other questions or comments? Please.
If Putin were to die,
oh God, yeah.
Who would fill the vacuum? What would be done?
Well, herein lies the danger of tyranny. Who follows? And someone was like, you know, you want to make Russia weak. You're pushing democracy that undermines. I'm sorry. You have the most nuclear weapons in the world other than the United States. All right. I think we all have a vested interest that a state with the military power to destroy planet Earth. Oh, and just by the way, how long? I like this fact. How long would it take the world to go back to normal after a nuclear war, after the mass explosion of thermonuclear bombs? Nearly 40,000 years. So, the simultaneous explosion of hundreds of thermonuclear bombs, I repeat, would take some 40,000 years. Plutonium has a half-life of 20,000 years to begin to decay. So, I would say that who takes power in Russia, we kind of all have a vested interest in. But the nature of tyranny is that Putin's trapped. He tried with Medvedev to try to almost to retire, you know, bring another buddy in who you could know wouldn't come after you for corruption. That's the ironic nature of tyranny. You can't give it up because once you've lived as a tyrant, how do you know that those who come next won't turn on you? And so you become trapped by it. And then who follows? Who is worthy? Are they, at least whatever the glaring errors of democracy, at least we all have a say. I mean, at least we all have a say. For better or for worse, we all get to vote. It's the popular will, to some extent, with the Electoral College. But it's at least we all have a say. In Russia, who takes power after Putin? I have no idea. Why do I also frame it that way? When Stalin died, his designated successor, Malenkov, he didn't stand a chance. He was quickly outmaneuvered by Nikita Khrushchev and others. So I have no idea. And by the way, Khrushchev was never expected to succeed Stalin. He wasn't seen as a contender. So I really don't know. But I have a sneaking suspicion they'll probably be similar to Putin. I think the evidence suggests they're probably not going to be a democratic leader. Yeah. Any other questions? Please. Wonderful.
It's always kind of, there's like the golden things, but do you think that while Lukashenko says he's going to step down and not empowering, that he's not going to run again, do you think that there's something wrong with that maybe in the future? They're both getting older.
They're going to die soon. You could look at the media tomorrow and one of them could be dead. So referencing the leader of Belarus to the west of the Russian state on the border of Lukashenko is that sometimes used to be called the last dictator in Europe, but he's now joined by Vladimir Vladimirovich. Well, I have a hard time imagining the person who takes power. It probably almost certainly will probably be someone like him that he's trying to raise up into power, but we don't know what will follow. I was in Belarus in 2005, so similar. They still exalt the Soviet state. Like they still have the statues of Lenin. It's very, 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 very interesting. But Lukashenko has also been engaged in a decades-long struggle with Putin. Like they've talked about combining Belarus and Russia. But Lukashenko was like, I want to be number 2 of it all. And Putin was like, that's not going to happen. So Lukashenko has his domain in Belarus. I don't know. But I feel uneasy about that because we have no idea what's going to happen. At least if it was an honest vote among the Russian people, well, maybe it's good for us, maybe it's bad, but at least it's the will of the people. They view democracy, they being Putin and someone like Lukashenko, as a recipe for disaster. And they resent the U.S. for pushing it. They think you have been destabilizing the world all around, from Iraq to Afghanistan to Libya. To Syria. That's why Russia, anyone know? He's in Moscow. In the years before, he's spent millions of dollars to buy super high-end apartments in Moscow, so that would be his nest egg. He got poisoned recently, almost died, but he made it. Putin, at one point, gave a speech in which he said to the U.S., like, do you know what you've done? Has in our mind, should Saddam Hussein, the vicious tyrant, be in power? I think the Iraqi people should have the right to pick their own destiny. Putin would say, you're a fool. You're going to create chaos. And here's the ironic part of this. The Russian, to some extent, the Chinese point of view, I repeat, would be your system can't work. You're like someone who jumped off a cliff. You think you're flying, but you're just falling, and you haven't hit the ground yet. I reject that. I reject that thesis. A world in which natural rights and individual dignity aren't respected. A world in which you don't have the right to stand up and yell at me and tell me I'm wrong and walk out. A world in which we can't criticize the president is destined for tyranny and suffering. And even if it was the most genius leader in the world, it'll go bad, it'll rot, it'll breed corruption. Nobody will tell the truth to the leader. That's chaos. That's what's destined for chaos. And the story of the Soviet Union seems to affirm that. Whatever our troubles, I'm with us for the long term. Come what may, it could be real interesting, but we have no other choice than the preservation and perpetuation of democratic governance in the republic. So that's the side I'm on. Putin would say I'm naive. He'd say you don't get it. But what other choice do we have? Any other thoughts? So that was a happy note to end on. Let's see. Any other comments, please?
Yeah. I think another component of this conversation is also the fact that, okay, there is the greatness of Russia, but the greatness of Russia means that the Russians in history, in centuries, millennia, they have never known what is democracy and freedom. So we are in the West. We have our vision, understanding, and it's inside us what is liberty. Liberty. There's the Russians that just don't understand these concepts.
And then it gets complicated, right? Because there might be someone from Russia who says, who are you to lecture me on Russian culture and history? You know, there are Russian values that are different. The ideal of what a leader is different. But this begs the question of cultural relativism, which is a fraught topic with danger in the sense that you look at certain topics. We talk about the context of women's rights in Saudi Arabia. Someone would say, you should not lecture Saudi Arabia on women's rights. I think a commitment to gender equality and equal rights for women should be a universal value. I'm sorry, that might make someone mad and they might perceive me as lecturing, but I'm not going to back down on that. But then it gets even more complicated. How do we craft policy with states who might have values at odds with our own? The U.S. has a long history of working with terrible leaders. There's a book on Latin American military dictators during the Cold War called "Thank God They're on Our Side." So this is also a legitimate criticism of U.S. foreign policy. It's the lack of, and this would be perhaps a Russian point of view, it's the lack of consistency that we resent. You're hypocritical. You preach these values. Sometimes you abide by them. Sometimes you violate them if it's in your interest. Which Putin was talking with Bush one time, right? And Putin basically said to Bush, like, it's obvious to me that you actually control the media in the U.S., you know. And I'm paraphrasing loosely, but Bush said, I would strongly suggest you not say that publicly. That makes you look really uninformed. From Putin's perspective, it's all rigged anyway. You know, I mean, in Putin's mind, like, yes, they say that it's all a lie. The power brokers are actually controlling it. So Putin views our system as corrupt as well. And to whatever extent that is true, he doesn't recognize the things that are also true. Legit, real democratic, and by democratic, I mean, we all vote. Lowercase d. We all vote, right? We all have a say, for better or for worse. The 2024 election, Donald Trump won that election democratically. That's that. That's the will of the country, and that has to be respected. 2020, Joe Biden won the election democratically. That's the will of the country. It has to be respected. It's the best we can do. Putin doesn't buy any of that. He thinks our system's corrupt. He thinks we're hypocritical. He thinks we violate our values whenever we want. And he says that, and this was his invasion of Ukraine. How dare you lecture me on Ukraine? You broke Iraq. 300,000 people died. You use military power whenever you want to. But when Russia does it, we're the bad guy. You form a coalition of countries around the world to pressure us, to punish us. And obviously I disagree with Putin, but I am endeavoring to offer the Russian perspective because I don't think our perspective is zero-sum right, 100%. There are some legitimate grievances from Russia, and we should take that seriously. So I hope you will come away from this conversation and engage that complexity with friends or family. Yes, Putin is a tyrant, but he doesn't see it that way. What do we learn from that? The most important question of all is, what do we learn? What do you gain? So I hope you'll think about that. And maybe, and I don't want you to be kept up at night by it, but I might be. If you sit up in the middle of the night and you're thinking about it, I don't think that's such a bad thing. Maybe we should weigh things in a more nuanced fashion. Thank you very much. Appreciate you being here. Thank you online. I appreciate you being here. If you would like to look into the book, it's on Amazon. It's also at Gibson's and Concord.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for Tyranny Takes Root about Vladimir Putin's Russia. For those of you online, the survey link is in the chat. It will also be sent via email. And for those of you here in person, there are surveys on the auditorium stage. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you all have a great night.
Thank you for coming.
And thank you to Brandon for joining us.
Now, the sad thing is that